This is track 4 in the Palace 2, denying service to DDoS protection services.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, my name is Allison Nixon, and I'm here to tell you how your DDoS protection may be flawed and what you can do about it. I work for Integralis. We do consulting, and personally, I do pen testing and incident response, and I'm also a host on the paul.com podcast. So I came across this bypass due to my long-standing fascination with malicious websites. I saw a lot of sites selling DDoS for hire or stolen credit cards, and it turns out that when you DDoS people, getting DDoS by your competitors is an occupational hazard, and I noticed that a lot of these malicious websites were protected by cloud-based DDoS mitigation. And it annoyed me because it obscured information about these malicious websites. So I worked to get rid of them. And it turns out that bypassing these services is extremely easy. So at this point, I can bypass DDoS protection in almost every situation, but I also realized a lot of legitimate websites also use these same services. So I thought maybe I should tell somebody about it. So here I am. So first, I'm going to explain how DDoS protection works. All of the affected providers I have looked at work in basically the same way. So first, the provider service acts as an HTTP reverse proxy that filters inbound requests, good and bad, and then passes along the good request to the server, aka the origin, where it's processed and then sent back out through the provider's IP. The important thing in this model is that the user cannot interact directly with the origin. So that's how it works in theory. And here's how it works when I bypass it. On the left side, you can see the normal operation. Traffic goes in, gets filtered, processed, goes back out. But on the right side, you can see you can take a more direct approach just by interacting with the origin directly. Once you can do that, you can bypass any filtering, scrubbing, or sanitization. And it's pretty simple. So the reason this is possible is because a lot of DDoS protection providers rely on the DNS protocol to reroute traffic. This is an inappropriate use of that protocol. DNS cannot be used to block any traffic, and it's not a network access control. You can prevent this bypass by keeping your origin IP secret, but it's a lot easier said than done. So what I'm going to talk about here is a cloud-based DDoS protection bypass. This is a fundamental problem with this method of rerouting traffic, and there can't be any patch for this. A lot of providers are affected. These same techniques work for bypassing other types of filtering, like cloud-based WAF or email filtering. Really, anything that uses DNS to reroute traffic to the filter. It can be bypassed by attacking the origin directly. So it turns out that this bypass is extremely easy. In my research, I've been able to unmask a protected website in about 15 to 30 minutes, the vast majority of the time. The more functionality a website has, the easier it is to unmask. So a large corporate website is a lot easier to unmask than, say, a malicious website, because those are generally pretty bare bones. There are 3 major ways that DDoS protection providers route their traffic to the filter. So first of all, there's the DNS-based routing, which is what we're talking about here. It involves pointing the customer's DNS to the provider's filters. The second method is BGP-based routing that involves making BGP announcements to an AS owned by the provider rather than the customer. And the third method is inline filtering that is done by providers selling a physical appliance that's installed in the customer's network inline. So while DNS-based routing is vulnerable to a complete bypass, the other 2 methods cannot be bypassed using these methods. So say you want to stick with DNS-based DDoS mitigation. There are several fundamental flaws that you're going to need to battle. You can't fix it with a patch, and you need to be aware of all the potential information leakage issues. And you also need to be aware of the risks that you're taking, because whenever your origin IP is found by attackers, you're more open to a DDoS attack. So I'm going to walk you through the major techniques for uncovering the origin IP of a DDoS protected website. At least these are the ones that I've been able to discover. I'm sure there's a lot more. So first of all, verification is very straightforward. You simply manually resolve the domain to the origin rather than the filter, and then you can interact with it directly. If there are access control rules preventing the origin from speaking to anyone outside the filter's range, then you can simply DDoS the IP into oblivion. And once you've taken it down, when you access the website normally, the provider will state that it only has a cached copy because the origin is unreachable. And if you're in doubt as to the origin IP, you could DDoS every IP in the target's range until something goes down. So I'm going to show you some screenshots to demonstrate the verification. So I set up a box on Amazon AWS and put up a simple web page and put it behind DDoS protection. I registered the domain nocloudallowed.com and set up encapsula DDoS protection for my site. And remember that IP starting in 54 because that's the origin. So now that I've set it up, my domain points to an encapsula-owned IP, as you can see here. And remember, the IP starts in 199, while my origin IP starts in 54. And using Wireshark, I can verify that my traffic is indeed going to and coming back from an encapsula-owned server. You can see the HTTP response has a lot of encapsula-specific headers and encapsula-specific cookies here. And the response is also gzip encoded, which my server does not do. This kind of response modification is typical of every provider I've looked at. So when you're trying to verify the origin, you might want to check for the absence of these headers. So now using the host file, I'm manually resolving the domain to my origin IP here. And back to Wireshark. So you can see the traffic is only going to the origin now, and the HTTP response headers are simple and unmodified. And the response is also not gzip encoded. So as you can see, bypassing DDoS protection is as simple as that and requires no special tools. So that is very easy, but it all relies on knowing the origin IP. So how do you find the origin? There are many techniques that you can use. You can search for domains that are tangentially related to your target on the off chance that they also point to the origin. Also, script kiddies tend to favor variants of the nmap DNS brute script, but there's a lot better options out there. There are services that archive historical DNS requests. So you can view historical DNS information, related subdomains, and a wealth of other information. So I won't name any of these services here, but if you have access to them, all power to you, because historical DNS is by far the most powerful tool for unmasking a DDoS protected website that I've used so far. When I consult these archives, I very rarely need to move on to the next step. Usually I can get the origin from there. And when people are setting up their websites, they just don't realize what kind of information is being recorded out there. So failing that, you can try to make some outbound connections. This is why a website with more functionality is easier to unmask than a website with less. The reason this works is because all the DDoS protection services that I've looked at act as HTTP reverse proxies. So they'll proxy inbound connections, but they don't proxy outbound connections. So if you can trick a server into connecting to your IP, then you can find the origin IP. One of my favorite ways is the avatar upload trick. So one of the malicious websites I was looking at had a forum where they could discuss their DDoSing service. So I just signed up for the website and uploaded an avatar that was hosted on my server. Tail F access log origin IP pops up right there as I'm uploading my avatar. So getting your target to send emails can also be useful, but a lot of websites separate their web server and mail server, so you may only get limited information from this. However, if you wanted to DOS or spam their email server, this could be very useful information. And you might also be able to discover the hosting provider that your target uses, so you may have some clues as to the IP range that the origin resides in. So, in some uncommon instances, accessing the /admin or other protected directory behind basic authentication can reveal the origin IP in the prompt. More rarely, there are overly helpful error messages and config files. Apparently, PHP info also gives this away as well. And I want to preface this by saying everything in this slide is illegal and don't do it, but it will be done. I have to admit, I haven't tested any of these personally, but I have seen them. But I have seen them advertised on hacking forums. So, in the past, people have submitted fake DMCA complaints to Cloudflare for the express purpose of obtaining the origin IP. So, when they fulfilled their obligation by responding, they also included the origin IP, and the attacker would just DOS the origin afterwards. The complaint was totally fake. So they changed their policy after that, but other providers may have abusable policies. I also saw some malicious Cloudflare dropping services being advertised as well. Apparently for the cheap and the free accounts, customers dropped into bypass mode if they get DDoS too much. Again, I can't say I've experimented with this personally. I don't know if it works, but the service has gotten positive feedback, so I don't know. We'll see. So, there's not been a lot of research into the area of tricking servers into divulging their public IP addresses, because historically this information has not been abusable. If the public-facing IP becomes interesting to attackers, we may see more of these issues being recorded and recognized as potential exploit vectors. There may be target-specific information leakage as well. In my pen testing work, I have found internal and external IP addresses left laying around in code comments as I was testing applications. So I think a diligent attacker will be able to find this information as well. And finally, this is the nuclear option. Think back to the earlier slide where I talked about manually verifying the origin IP. So this tool does that verification, but it does it for every single IP in an arbitrary range that you give it, theoretically up to and including the whole internet. Even if there is no information leakage, if the target is in the scanner's range, it will be found. If you rely on security by obscurity, by keeping your origin secret, this tool might be able to remove that obscurity. So now you know how easy it is to bypass DNS-based DDoS protection. You probably want to know, what can I do to protect myself? So if you have to stick with a DNS-based service, you can change your configuration to make it less likely that your origin IP will be found. But frankly, this is a difficult proposition. First of all, you need to implement some non-standard configurations which could backfire on you if you need to go into bypass mode and your admins forget that it exists. You also need to find and plug all your sources of IP leakage. Also, by keeping your origin IP secret, you have to solve a problem that most people don't have to solve. The public-facing IP of your server is not intended to be private information. Unlike, say, passwords, which are supposed to be hashed and kept in a safe place, your public-facing IP exists in many places, such as config files, ACL rules, and is, of course, completely accessible by the public. You may take some comfort in the fact that you're forging new frontiers in network security as you research new ways of finding ways to keep your public IP private. So the least I can do is help you out with some pointers. First, you must realize the fact that you are relying on security by obscurity. Your origin IP needs to be kept secret. To do that, you need to inspect your web applications for outbound connections which could betray you, including outbound mail, error messages. You need to take stock of all your DNS records, including historical DNS records. You also need to find IP leakage issues that are specific to quirks in your setup, so good luck with that. And remember that anytime an attacker can find your origin IP, they can attack you. After your IP is leaked and directly attacked, you're going to have to change it. And then you're going to have to fix everything you broke by doing all of the above. So you may be thinking, I have DDoS protection. Am I vulnerable? If your provider's service contract requires you to own a minimum of a /24 block of IP addresses, BGP-capable router, and some other things, it's most likely they are using BGP to reroute your traffic and cannot be bypassed using this tactic. If there is a box somewhere in your data center purchased explicitly for DDoS protection, then that sounds like inline filtering and also not bypassable. But if your DDoS protection provider promises easy and convenient setup and only requires you to change your DNS records, then you've got a problem. As you can see, inappropriately using DNS to reroute traffic through the filter is a much thornier proposition than initially advertised. If you switch to any BGP-based or inline filtering, you don't need to worry if people want to access your public-facing IP because it's all going through the filter anyways. You also don't need to play hide and seek with your infrastructure. And finally, the vendor's response to this whole issue. In the course of my research, I found that the same fundamental issue was being abused by script kiddies. So while I didn't feel any obligation to treat it like a 0-day, I was able to unmask just about every website I looked at. So the effectiveness of this was quite shocking. In the interest of being responsible, I did report it to the major vendors. Some never responded, but those that did said this. Only one vendor told me so far that they had any plans to advise their customers. Well, 2 now, I guess. In the meantime, I can bypass their services at will. Thank you for listening to me today. You can download the most up-to-date version of the scanner at nocloudallowed.com. Special thanks to Chris Camajo, Brandon Levine, and many, many thanks to Integralis. By the way, that scanner is not going to be up until I can get access to the internet, which might be a few days. Sorry. Any questions?
Allison, did you notice any difference in the paid versus free DDoS protection services and what they offer?
Can we get the microphone, the speaker microphone?
Sorry, the question was, did you notice any difference in the options that the DDoS protection services offer in pay versus free? Did they offer any more? Do the pay services offer any more options? Right.
I didn't feel like paying for anything, so I don't know.
Hi, Allison. I'm Matthew from Cloudflare. Thank you for disclosing this to us. So the first thing is I have actually a question of another potential mitigation and to get your take on it. Would it work if you set up your origin on RFC 1918 space and then established a private VLAN between the provider and the backend? That way you could keep the origin on an IP address, which is there. You could tell everyone what that IP address, but it wouldn't be publicly routable.
Yeah, so that's one of the ideas I was thinking about. It would be possible. If the server does not know its public-facing IP address, it can't give it up. So I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. So I think it's worth a shot.
If you'd like to test the paid versions of our platform, where we support BGP and other ways of hiding your origin, we'd be happy to set up an account for you.
I didn't know you guys had a BGP-based service.
Well, so, we have 1.5 million customers. Most of them are not super savvy, and they don't have their own /24. Some of them are, the United States government. I would challenge you to find where their origin is.
Challenge accepted? Give me some sites.
Okay. find me afterwards. But as you said, if they're using BGP, it's going to be awfully difficult.
If they're using BGP, their origin IP is public, and it's not bypassable using these techniques. But if you're challenging me to unmask sites, I would gladly take you up on that challenge. Now, it's definitely true that there are some configurations where they cannot be unmasked because the information is not leaked. But in practice, the vast majority of the people are unable to have those kinds of configurations because the kind of software that's available today, a lot of it betrays your IP. Like if you want to run a forum software, all of them have functions that will betray your IP. Things like that, it just makes it very difficult to keep that info secret.
Thank you.
Thank you. So is that it? You have a question? Can you run back to the microphone? Thank you.
Just had a question if you ever tested against Prolexic.
So actually I spoke to someone with Prolexic a few days ago. The PLX proxy service is DNS based and is affected. I spoke to them and he said something along the lines of he's going to advise his customers. I don't have any visibility into emails that they send to their customers, so I don't know what they said.
Okay, I know they offer a routed solution. I believe it's the BGP based.
They do.
Just wondering if you had any exposure to that, because I know we kind of have a similar setup where we actually have an IPsec tunnel with them. So the servers would be RFC 1918, and then they basically respond back over the IPsec tunnel. And just wondering if you've seen any vulnerabilities or to get around that solution.
So anything BGP based is not vulnerable to this kind of bypass because when you're sending traffic to an IP, you have no choice in how it's routed. What BGP does is it reroutes the traffic from the customer's AS to an AS owned by the filter, and then that traffic is scrubbed and then routed back to the customer through a tunnel. So you have no choice in how your traffic is routed. That's why you can't bypass it.
All right, thank you.
So, do you see customers that are using the DNS mechanism for traffic steering work with their upstream providers? A lot of these cloud solutions in regards to DDoS protections do provide their source addresses when they source net. And you mentioned in regards to just DDoSing the use your relationships to provide that source address information to block upstream. It's really taken off.
Yeah, so upstream filtering is another possibility, but that's a separate service. I'm only focusing on this service. And frankly, it's something that can be reduced to zero effectiveness. Actually, another interesting thing is when you're looking at a DDoS protected web page, only the port 80 traffic is forwarded, or SSL if it has that service. So if you can find the origin, the attack surface actually becomes a lot larger because then you can find traffic. You can find services running on other ports, which is very interesting. So, any more questions?
I just noticed that the prime under the internal server error. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's probably getting DDoSed or something. Any more questions? All right, thanks everyone. And as soon as I can get on the internet, I'm going to put the code up.